Namaskar and welcome to this exciting new episode of Saptology Debunking Mythology. So we last time we discussed the concept of Shakti in the Vedic culture and compared it across the world with the other definitions of feminine divinity. You already had two programs on that. Today is the second series of the same program where we are going to talk about the the concept and importance of Shakti in the Hindu culture, which has been the oldest culture of the planet, oldest living culture of the planet. And you can see a lot of people uh, somehow finding faults due to lack of information or propaganda or untruthful characterization and basically mythology. So we are going to debunk that, and we're also going to discuss something more, that how it positively affects us and how it is very important and very scientific. So without delay, let us welcome very famous author and columnist Sri Nitin Sridhar. Welcome, Nitinji.
Namaste. Thank you
Namaste.
for having me again.
Yeah. So this Shakti is a very important concept in the Hindu culture, but but somehow it is being like people are also getting confused in Hindu culture because of the propaganda. So, what does Shakti mean in a Hindu culture?
That is a very, very difficult question to answer. I mean, uh, it is one of those terms which you have to live. You have to live in the culture to intuitively grasp, so to speak. And something, Sri Raju Malhotra in his book has included this among one of the 54 non-translatables. However, that is true. I mean, much of the Hindu concept cannot be translated fully, but because we are speaking in English and we are writing and communicating in English, some kind of translation is needed or a definition, so to speak. So, Shakti is, I mean, transactional sense, we can say that Shakti refers to power, Shakti refers to ability to do something. It refers to perhaps even energy or something like that. But in a Hindu context, when we speak about Shakti as in the sense of cosmogony, in the sense of theology, then it has a specific reference to the divine feminine, the fundamental power that moves the universe, that enables the universe to function. So a proper understanding, let me quote a shloka from the in Sri Adi Shankaracharya. In his first verse of Saundarya Lahari, he says basically that without Shakti, the Shiva cannot move, or something like that. He said Shiva and Shakti together creates the universe. And that is a kind of concept that we have. And there is a very famous tantric phrase or quote that Shiva without Shakti is Shava. Use in the term Shiva, I, Ikaranta, the E, it refers to Shakti. So if you remove the I from the Shiva, it becomes Shava. So it's a play of words, but basically it is conveying this, that when we speak in the terms of Shiva, Shakti, Shiva refers to what is called as Chit or conscious principle of the world, and Shakti refers to the Kartrutva or the power or the activity principle of the cosmos. In the, if we have to use the Sankhyan categorization, it is Purusha and Prakriti. See, these are all different darshanas. They are not exactly same. They're equivalent. So Purusha is the conscious principle. The Prakriti is the cause of the material universe, is the content of the material universe. In the Vedanta, she is Maya. She is the material cause of the universe. So Brahman is in Vedanta, Brahman is considered as the ultimate reality, ultimate cause of the universe, and this Maya is the power of Brahman, Shakti of Brahman. So this is a different darshanas approach a little bit differently, but from a practical point of view, from a practitioner devotional point of view, in fact, one of the texts define Shakti or the supreme goddess as the ultimate reality itself, as Brahman itself. I think even Swami Ramakrishna Paramahamsa used to call that, Brahman is Shakti, Shakti is Brahman. So it is a perspective and the darshana you take into account. But basically, in a practical day to day life, Shakti refers to the divine feminine. See, we Hindu practitioners, we perceive the ultimate reality. We believe that though the ultimate reality, which is called as Brahman in the Upanishads, is without any form, is beyond all the words, beyond expressions, beyond forms, beyond all kind of descriptions. Despite being so, for the sake of the devotees, this one infinite whole manifests in infinite number of forms. It can, this one without any form can manifest, can take upon hundreds and thousands of forms for the sake of devotees. So we worship this ultimate reality through different forms, as Shiva, as Vishnu, as Devi. So in this everyday sense of worship, when we speak about Shakti, we speak about divine as feminine, the ultimate reality in her female aspect, the ultimate reality in the aspect of power, in the aspect of that is what power is, Shakti, in the aspect of that which enables things, that which moves the things, that which causes the universe, that which sustains the universe, that which brings destruction of the universe. I can give another example here. When many of the texts you see that every male deity has a corresponding female deity. Like, I mean, in common conception, we have that Brahma is married to Saraswati, Vishnu is married to Lakshmi, and Shiva is married to Gauri or Parvati or Kali, whatever the phrasing is used. But there is another way of looking at it. The Shakti or the wife of Vishnu is Vaishnavi. He has the same name, Vishnu Vaishnavi. Brahma Brahmi. Shiva Shiva. So we have this to denote that the male, the masculine principle refers to the conscious principle, but the female principle is the energy, is the power principle, is what the action principle, so to speak. There is the chit principle, there is kartritva. But in a more transcendental sense, every deity is also the ultimate reality. So Shakti is even Chit Shakti. See, Shakti can be understood as Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti, and Icha Shakti. So that covers pretty much everything. So Shakti is also the Chit. So we have a famous saying about Tripura Sundari. Tripura Ananta Shakti Aikya Rupini Sarva Sakshini Sa Chiti Sarvata Purna Paricheda Vivarjana. What it basically means is she is Ananta Shakti Aikya Rupini. She is the she represents the Aikya, the union of all the three Shaktis. What are the three Shaktis? What the different forms of Shaktis? They are the main three forms are that Jnana, Icha, and Kriya Shakti. Kriya Shakti is the power which enables, which facilitates our actions. We are able to perform something because of this Kriya Shakti. The Jnana Shakti, the Shakti or the power of knowledge. We can be able to perceive something. We are able to understand something. Everything is the conscious, the manifestation of consciousness is because of Chit Shakti. And then we have Icha Shakti, the power of willpower, so to speak, the Sankalpa Shakti. All this, the Icha Shakti is Sankalpa Shakti. So there are different ways and layers. That is why I said it is very difficult to understand. It has to be difficult to explain. It has to be intuitively grasped when Hindus speak about Shakti or Shakti worship or we worship to Devi in her form of Durga, Kali, Lalita, Tripura Sundari, Lakshmi, Saraswati. They can at one level they can be understood as Shakti as the uh, personification of particular aspect of Brahman or the ultimate reality, or they can be understood as the Shakti or the power of Brahman. And the main power, as I said, is the Maya Shakti, which is of two forms, Vikshepana and Avarana Shakti, and the opposite is also the Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti, and Icha Shakti. So Shakti is many. That is why Shakti is innumerable in some sense. That everything is inhabited by Shakti. Everything is moved by Shakti, as they say. So it is very difficult to pinpoint what Shakti is. And at a very Vyavaharic level, yes, Shakti, but Shakti, one thing which is common to all definitions of Shakti, perhaps, is that Shakti denotes power. I mean, I do not have any proper exact English translation for the word Shakti, but power, in my opinion, comes close to it. In whatever way we see it, however you see it, Shakti denotes power. It denotes the ability to do something. It's the ability, it may be the ability to understand the highest knowledge, which is what Jnana Shakti enables us. It may be the ability to get the things done, the Kriya, the actions in our everyday life, which is Kriya Shakti, or it is the ability to take strong decisions, ability to take sankalpa that we will do this, we will not do this, the willpower, the indriya nigra, the control of the mind and the senses, the restrainment of the mind of senses. All this is possible because of Icha Shakti. And the Saraswati, Lakshmi, and Kali, they from a particular perspective, they can be seen as the personification or the deities which which inhabit these Shakti, which are personification of these Shakti. Saraswati is associated with Jnana Shakti, Kali is associated with Kriya Shakti, and Lakshmi, Mahalakshmi is associated with Icha Shakti. We see this particular association in the famous text of Devi Mahatmya, wherein which gives the story, which gives the account of goddess Chandika.
So very well put, and I think you put it rightly also. The Shakti has no direct meaning in English. For the viewers who want to learn more about these concepts, you should learn Sanskrit, and that's how you can appreciate them. Now, another important aspect from the Hindu perspective, I can say, is that there are a lot of followers of Shakti. Like, for example, right before the Mahabharata war, Krishna asks Arjun to worship Durga and take her blessings. And this also shows that even Parabrahma is also encouraging people to take shelter of Shakti for doing actions on the ground, on earth. And here you can see there is no dichotomy. It's not that Krishna is competing with Shakti or Shiva is competing with Shakti, Krishna is competing with Shiva. There's no such thing. Because Arjuna, even though he was a friend and a devotee of Krishna, but he goes to Tripurari to get the weapons. And then he goes to Indra to get other weapons. So the whole thing is a cooperation. It's like a one system running, we can say well-oiled machinery. There's no friction. There's no. So where do many Hindu people get confused? Why do you think that they get confused?
See, I think the root of this confusion that we are seeing today is basically is in the secular education, the deracinated education that is imparted to students. Even a generation back, children were brought up in this Hindu culture. Children were brought up with the stories from the Puranas and Itihasas, the accounts of how Rama defeated Ravana, how the Pandavas defeated the, the Kauravas in Mahabharata. You know, the 1988, the serial of Mahabharata was a super hit across the India. But so this was the kind of upbringing people had, wherein we are able to intuitively connect with the divinity. See, bhakti is a very intimate, individualized connection between a devotee and a deity. It may be with Ganesha, it may be with Shakti, it may be with Shiva, it may be with multiple deities at the same time. I can give from my own example. I'm basically, my sadhana started with Shakti, one of the forms of Shakti. And then that sadhana itself led me to another form of Shakti, right? And at the same time, I consider Ganesha as a brotherly figure to me. I consider Shiva as a fatherly figure to me. See, I consider the very less known form called Ganeshini. Ganeshini is the feminine energy of, or feminine version of Ganesha. She is the Shakti of Ganesha. And this Ganeshini I consider as my sisterly form. And I relate to each of them at a level of sadhana, at the level of bhakti. So this is a very deep connection. This is a very individualized connection. And the Shastras, the Bhakti Shastras, and all these are meant to facilitate this development of Bhakti. See, I am a very much, by philosophical leaning, I am a Advaita Vedantin. I follow the teachings of Adi Shankaracharya Bhagavad Pada. And for bhakti, I rely upon Madhusudana Saraswati, another Vedantin, but also very great Krishna Bhaktam. And his Bhagavad Bhakti Rasayana, which is based upon Bhagavata Purana, is a wonderful work. And the definition of bhakti it gives, and these are all very much relevant across the sampradayas. It is not limited to only one sampradaya or another sampradaya. These are very basic definitions that are useful and has been applied by acharyas of all sampradayas. So, but the function of acharya is to facilitate the direct connection between devotee and the deity, and not to act as a mediators. Our gurus are not mediators; they are not priests, right? They are facilitators. They hold our hands and help us to move forward. As the Guru word says, one who removes darkness, right? They show a lamp to us and take us further. But ultimately, we have to travel. It is our individual journey. So, lot of confusion, to return to your question, is happening because children who are growing nowadays in the last 1 or 2 decades, they are not growing up in a very spiritually, in a very dharmically and adhyatmically conductive environment. So they are growing up in a very secular environment, especially in India. That the parents, many of the parents, I will not say all of them, many of them, the only thing they encourage children is to grow up, make good money, get a good job, married, settle. That's it. The question asked when they are small kids is, what will you become? What job will you do? What career will you take up? They are not taught to aspire for ideals. Like, will you become like Rama? Will you become like Krishna? Will you become like Devi Sita? Will you become like Draupadi? Will you become like Shakti Durga? They are not taught that. They are not held up these ideals. This is no longer being done. So there is a kind of dissonance. See, if I have to speak about my own journey, when I was in high school, my first introduction to any kind of philosophy was Western philosophy, with the questions that Socrates asked, and then Descartes asked, "Who am I? What is the reality?" And the rationalism, reasoning. And when I applied that standards of reasoning to Hindu Dharma and I asked questions, the people around me, they were unable to answer satisfactorily to me because they never dwelled on those questions much. So I rejected the whole Hindu pantheon, Hindu religion per se, and I consider myself an atheist. And this happened for 3 to 4 years or 5 years, so to speak. But then one good thing, at least with me, was that I always search for truth. I had uh, intuitional or inner quest for philosophical truth and reality. And then I started reading Hinduism as time passed, little bit here, little bit there, little bit somewhere. So not under a guru that ideally one should study, but on my own, little bit here, there, and everywhere. And that led me to that removed a lot of questions. I found answers to my own questions basically. And then slowly, by the divine grace, by the grace of divine mother Kali, I was led to one thing after another, one person after another, one book after another, and then finally into sadhana in a very unexpected ways. So if you're sincere in your seeker, the mother is always there. The Shakti, the divine mother always looks after you. This is my firm conviction, my own experience. But the point is, I know that I have met a lot of people like me who have this similar curve, similar trajectory in their lives, that they began as a agnostics or atheists and then rediscovered their Hindu Dharma. But why is this situation coming today? It is coming largely because of our education system, which teaches modern science. See, there is nothing wrong in hard sciences like physics, chemistry, maths. That is all fine. The problem arises that the principles that are relevant in these sciences are applied as universal principles to all paradigms. For example, paradigm of religion. The main fundamental two paradigms that are applied is the principle of verifiability and falsifiability. The falsifiability and verifiability. These are fundamental principles of science that only that thing is acceptable which can be falsified or verified. But this is not applicable outside the paradigm of science. We need to understand that in the West, or modern science is rooted in basically Western civilization, and there they do not per se have the notion of pramanas that is there in our Hindu civilization, and especially they do not have a notion of Shabda Pramana. Yes, the Christian and other religions have their books. They are called as religion of the books. That is fine. But I think the Hindu notion of Shabda Pramana is very much different from the notion of the books that they have in their religions. And I recently did a lecture on this. I have been speaking about this. See, the Mimamsa and the Nyaya schools have dealt in very much depth on this. What is a Shabda? What are the notions of Shabda? The notion of Apta Vakya, the word of a trustworthy person. For example, our rishis or sages, they have said something in a Shastra. We consider it as authentic because they write it based on their own uh, yogic vision, so to speak. For example, what Vyasa has written in Mahabharata and Puranas, he has written based on his tapasya, based on his yogic vision. The historical question aside, these books serve as the fundamental foundation for our dharma, for our dharmic life, and for our adhyatmic life. So I'm not translating the terms dharma and adhyatma for a reason. Adhyatmic, spiritual in some sense, yes, but dharma is more difficult to translate. It is the very core of our life, way of life, the fundamental principles of our living. All these are missing in the current education scenario, and worse, the education scenario is the secular education that is prevalent in India and elsewhere. It is actually preventing the young children, the teenage kids, even the others from actually properly accessing our Hindu knowledge treasure in an intuitive manner. What they are putting up blocks now we have so many scholars. See, I respect all the scholars who are working on dating of Mahabharata, dating of Ramayana. That is all good. That is perhaps needed. I don't mind. But there is fundamental problem here. This worm of this obsession with dating, this problem started with the Western Indology and their dating and historicity, and it's a lot more complicated, and I won't go into detail. I do not know myself all the details. A lot of better scholars like Dr. Vishwa Adluri and Joydeep Bakshi have done analysis of this historicity issue. All this started 200 years ago. If we were to travel back in time and ask any of our Hindu ancestors to 200, 250 years back about whether Ramayana was historical, Mahabharata was historical, that question would not make sense to them, because that is not central to our philosophical pursuit. That is not central to our adhyatmic pursuit. That is not central to our dharmic pursuit. In fact, that kind of misleads us into a never-ending process which completely takes us away from the actual purushartha that we have to follow, the actual purpose that we have to fulfill in our life. So these modern narratives, modern frameworks have continuously put obstacles in the paths of colonized Hindus to decolonize themselves, to rediscover their own Hindu dharma, their own Hindu heritage, their own philosophical roots, philosophical frameworks, etc. So this is the reason why you see problem in modern society, modern Indian society, that we have become disconnected from our roots, and we are the education system ensures that once one is out of the university system, one becomes completely deracinated. If we become thick-skinned and still say that we want to connect back to our roots despite the education system, we have, through this education and media and such, that we would have imbibed so many modern ideas and biases and prejudices that it continuously tries to prevent us from accessing our knowledge systems in a intuitive, in a proper, from a Hindu perspective, so to speak. See, Hindu dharma is not all about intuition. See, it is not all hocus pocus and hunky dory, such kind of thing. Our dharma is highly logical. We have an entire darshana of Nyaya Darshana dedicated to one single individual pursuit of logic, of rationality, of epistemology, of the theory of knowledge. So when I say that we have to understand our religion, our deities in an intuitive sense, I am not saying that we should be irrational. But the rationality of the Nyaya is rooted in certain Indic frameworks, certain Hindu frameworks, certain Hindu philosophical ideas, to which we currently do not have access because of the obstructions and obstacles that is being placed by modern education. Those of us who are trying to continuously to remove these obstacles are able to access to some extent. Even today, I become sometimes I suddenly, there is a flash of thought, and I suddenly realize that the thought that I had till that moment was somehow not indigenous to Hindu tradition. It was a modern phenomenon which I thought to be of Hindu. A good example is much of the modern so-called conservative Hindu attitude towards sex is a Victorian attitude which have been interiorized. So we need to be very careful and in understanding, in recovering the meaning that has been lost from Hindu civilization. The meaning is there. The Shastras are there. The Acharyas are there. The tradition is not dead. Sanskrit is not dead. Sanskriti is not dead. But many of us have become disconnected from it, and we need to recover meaning at an individual level. And it is possible, I would add. It is definitely possible. It takes effort. It would take a lot of effort per se, perhaps, but it is possible.
you mentioned some important points about the children, and children learn what parents know. Very simple. So it's the more the problem of the missing generation, I call it. The people who were purposely or planned way, they went against as a rebel. They, like in a family, when somebody goes as a rebellious nature, then automatically there is a lost information link over there. Now they have to learn first, because if you want your children to follow, you have to learn yourself. And it's very simple. If you think there is a need, expecting a child to learn something which you yourself never taught is a very imaginary thing. Now, coming back to the Indian school, you mentioned about Indian education system. Purposely, the doubts, instead of going to an authority, like I always give an example, that if you want to know about dharma, you're not going to ask a vegetable seller, tell me about dharma. You're not going to ask him, or you're not going to go to a big departmental store and ask the shopkeep the people who manage the aisles over there. You ask them what is dharma. Not possible. You have to go to an authority of the nowadays. I see people, when their parents, when they teach their children, they say, oh, he looks like this Bollywood star or this Tollywood star, or he behaves like this. So now the Shakti and other people are replaced by actors. Now they are just acting. They are working on a script. Now they cannot teach you anything other than acting, because after the movie, when they behave in a certain different way, now again the image is broken over there, because many of the actors were caught taking drugs recently in their real life.
See, there is a concerted, sorry to interject, there is a concerted attempt in academia, media, and some vested interests to deliberately misportray Hindu icons. See, even today, Rama, Krishna, etc., they are icons for large number of Hindus in semi-urban, tier 2, tier 3 cities. Even today, this is true. However, this is also fast changing. See, there is in the academia, in the media, etc., there is a concerted attempt to portray, for example, Rama as a loser and uphold Ravana as some kind of a tragic hero. And this is a very disturbing thing, and this is happening at a very fast pace and very. It is not just a occasional outpourings of some deracinated persons. There is a concerted attempt. There is a concerted academic level, at the media level, at the activist level. There is a concerted attempt to misportray, to ruin the image of these cultural civilizational icons, to destroy the civilizational whatever connection we still have with the connection. See, once you discredit our Rama, you discredit our, Krishna is portrayed as a womanizer. So that is a very well-known portrayal. So once we discredit our gods, our deities, then it would be very easy. The next stage would be, once you discredit the deities, the Hindu masses will become disconnected from this great civilization, from their own motherly civilization. Then it would be very easy for the evangelists to fill in the gaps and convert. So there is a multi-level coordinated attempt, and whether it is done intentional coordination or it is unintentional coordination, or whether there is a symbiotic relation, whatever be the nature of relationship, but this is how it is happening. First, you discredit the icons, you disconnected the masses from their civilizational roots, then they become easy prey for the evangelical vultures. So this is what is happening, and the education system is further facilitating this. And unfortunately, as you said, the missing generations, Hindu generations, they see, blaming everyone is okay, but they are perhaps the greatest blame lies upon them. Because they they have started a series of process which will have a very serious drastic impact on Hindu civilization in the coming generation, because it's a vicious cycle. One generation is deracinated, their children are deracinated, their children will be more deracinated, and the degree of deracination increases. Of course, there has been examples of reverse, that one generation is deracinated, the other is recovering, and the process of recovering of meaning. But that is, the amount of people doing that is comparatively less. See, today we see that in the last 10 years and 15 years, there has been huge awakening of Hindu consciousness, so to speak, in India, and people are coming out of their long sleep, so to speak. But if you speak purely in terms of volume, the number of people awakening is happening in a very decentralized manner through through some through being what to say, being influenced, being able to realize the great injustice being done to Hindu civilization, maybe at a philosophical level, at academic level, at political level, social level, through multiple things that is happening around us. But the volume is very less compared to the millions of children who are trained in this secular, non-Hindu, deracinated education every single year. You just imagine, entire generation of people are being taught to be dhimis, being taught to look down upon our own civilization, to look down upon our own deities, our own acharyas, gurus, etc., and our own traditions as superstitions. And then a handful of them, even if that handful is 1,000 people or 10,000 people, compare, if you contest with our total population, these 10,000 people or even 1 lakh people is very less, or awakening up, or reversing the colonial education, the deracination that has been happened. So the volume, there is no match. The institutionalized colonization that is continuing in India, he has upper hand through and through, and this needs to be reversed somehow or the other. But at least the situation now is a bit better than what was 10 or 15 years back. I would definitely say it is better, that we are talking today here, and a lot of people listening in US and lot more will listen after you upload on YouTube, is a good positive evidence, so to speak, that many people are waking up, and many people will wake up, or will start this decolonizing process, right?
You mentioned correctly, because the goals posts have been shifted, so that every goal will be fired in the incorrect direction. So now bringing back here in the conversation, one of the things which we do mention here, because the it's a very big task. If it can be done by the government, it's easy, because these are very popular leaders and they have the reach to the masses. But we have hardly, we, at least I have not heard anyone saying, many people say in their private meetings but not in public meetings. Now, in the public meetings, if they mention, when they address these kind of issues, it can have a large impact on the society. But you did mention about vested interests also. The reason is, your leaders are bad. If your leaders are bad, if someone says that your leaders are bad, means I'm talking about Acharya and the Guru, then automatically my leaders become good. And it's a very human psyche. That if this is bad, then this is good. And the real popular people in the people's conscience are these actors and these vested interests who have made it very attractive to be rebellious. And so the but you don't get anything. I mean, not a single actor will pay you any money, neither they'll pay you any attention, and even to get a picture from them, it will be very difficult for you. But the accessibility of Devi Devta is very easy, because by chanting a mantra you can feel it inside, because ultimately it's a feeling inside which matters. By chanting a mantra or a prayer, you feel enlivened again, you're back. That experiential aspect of Hindu culture is not being taught. because once you learn the experiential aspect, then you immediately don't get attracted to such things. Simply by logic and reasoning is not possible, and that experiential system is still lacking even in the educated people, because we have made, the science, when I talk about shakti and gyan and yoga bhakti, this is discussed in very elite circles, very elite educated circles. It has not percolated to the masses, just the way Ramayana Mahabharata was percolated to the masses so that ordinary people can learn it. Like Mahabharata, Ramayana has every single detail of Shakti which you possibly find in any part of the Veda, but in a very beautiful story format, where Bhagwan Ram is told, is very minimizing the culture. Bhagwan Ram fought with Ravan and the war got it. This is not Ramayana. Ramayana is much more than that. And then how did Ram prepare? How did Dashrath prepare? Similarly, this is Mahabharata also. So how do you see that this experiential aspect of the Hindu Sanatan culture can be mass told to people?
Yes. See, this is again I see it as a particularly problem of urban India rather than rural India, but that may not be completely true as well, because times are fast changing. But with technology, see, technology is useful as well as it has great disadvantages as well. On one hand, the disadvantages is in the form of increased materialism and attachment to material things. I cannot imagine living without having a Wi-Fi at home, right? So the basic problem is, if you go to any temple today in India, even now we see a lot of people coming. Even now it is there. Even now it is there that when among across the communities, it is not just one particular community or caste or something. Across the communities, even now it is there. When we think about going to on a vacation, we think about going to a pilgrimage, and that is there even today, except in uh, urban tier 1 tier 2 cities, so to speak, or even tier 3 now. But the point is, uh, today that experiential thing at home is particularly missing. Temple going thing is, though still we have retained, thankfully. Doing something at home is completely missing. There might have been a time in the past when this, British, before the colonization, when the traditional society was organized in a different way, that there was not there not all communities needed to do personal puja at home. There might have been time, but even then that was not true. See, we have all these Shakta, Shaiva, Ganapata, Saura, all these sampradayas. They were actually sampradayas of personal worship, wherein each connects to a particular Ishtadevata at their personal level, irrespective of communities. What we need today in India, as I see it, is we need to revive the worship of deities. We need to make worship of deities cool. And we need acharyas who are proselytizing in nature among Hindus as well as outside Hindus. The only way to do this is through revival. So despite many problems I have with ISKCON, I really admire them for their commitment to this. They go everywhere. I have seen so much videos even in foreign countries. I mean, the courage that they show, it's completely admirable. Even India, I have noticed, they are very dedicated to spreading what they believe is true. We need similar kind of organizations regarding all the deities, on the Shakti aspect, on the Shiva, on the Vaishnava, who have to go from village, city to city, and revive personal worship. See, this has happened in the past many times in India. For example, a good example I would give is, two examples I will give. One is the Vaishnava Sampradaya in South India, that the Sri Vaishnavas, wherein the followers of Ramanujacharya, They gave dikshas to a lot of people and initiated them in the worship of Vishnu. Similarly, in Karnataka, the Lingayats, the Veerashaivas, they gave Linga and the Diksha to lot of people and initiated them into a particular form of Shiva worship. Shaiva Siddhanta did that same in Tamil Nadu as. So, and we in the Bengal and the East India, the Shakta worship was very prominent. In the East India, especially, the Shakta, the Krishna worship, both were very dominant. And so this we need to revive. And even today in the all the Hindi belt in the northern India, the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas ji is very famous. Even today, people study it, read it, chant it, do parayana of it. We need to revive this more and more, especially in the urban area. See, we need to tackle two different audiences in a two different way, right? Because the urban audience have to be tackled in a different way, and and a semi-urban and rural audience have to be tackled in a different. The traditional methods work very much well, but the urban for the urban audience, I think a different strategy is needed. And some of the work is already been done by organizations like Chinmaya Mission, Vidya Parampara, Ramakrishna Mission, even ISKCON, etc. They're doing their work prominently in urban areas, and they're doing great work. And even modern movements like Isha Foundation, Art of Living, they are not uh, they are not traditional sampradayas, but they are able to bring lot of deracinated folks, crypto Christian folks, if I have to speak in Indian context, back into Hindu fold. Even though their recovery is still at a superficial level, they have, I'm speaking about, I'm not making a comment on any guru or any teacher, but the kind of public, kind of followers I'm speaking, some of them, even though their journey has just started, at least they have shifted the focus from one on deracination to one on recovery, and that is a great achievement. So these are happening in a very diversified format, and that is true. But we need more, kind of a more of this. That is what I felt. We need to revive the worship of our deities, and that is how the personal worship part can come. We need to revive it, make it cool more and more and more. That is what I, in my humble opinion, is the way forward.
No, great answer, and I think our time is up. But I want to just top it up with one last point, and then we'll discuss it and we'll move it. Uh, One of the important things you mentioned many important things, and particularly mentioned ISKCON and other places. These organizations, one thing is common, that they engage their people approaching to the masses, and so that process creates more faith. But many other organizations and cultures, I support all of them, they are not able to create that. They're not able to create a mass program. So when you keep it as niche, that only the few, then you'll always have few people, because you cannot just take it to the masses. So the simplification has to be done in the modern context. So I've seen many ISKCON kids, and they're very proud to worship deities, very proud. In fact, their parents encourage that today my son has done the arti and he's singing bhajan, and then taking them out on the street. And I can tell you from personal example or personal experience is that most of the Western cities have at least one public sankirtan once a week in ISKCON. And they have that missionary zeal that people should hear Krishna's names. Now, I have not seen that happening for Ganesh and Shiva, that people have to hear. And in fact, many people they oppose. And this zeal has come from the Western audience, their Western congregations, because Western congregation is trained to spread. That's how they in Bible and other Christian words, it is said that if you spread it, the God loves you more. Same is written in Bhagavad Gita also. Krishna says, anyone who tells about me to others is very dear to me. Now, that aspect has not been shared with the children, because even though it is mentioned there, somehow it has been told we don't preach, and we are very proud we don't preach. Why? It is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita. If you preach, then you become dear to me. Krishna says it. So now the point is that very selective use of scriptures, just to scripture should not be used to justify your own point. Scripture should be used to learn and change our viewpoint. Is a different thing which is being said.
Yes, I fully agree with you. Two, three quick points is, see, there is a very easy solution. If Hindu parents wake up, even the deracinated people, parents, wake up today, and the young parents especially, who are married and who decide to have kids, they wake up and they decide, fine, I was not taught our religious things. That is okay. And I may not be perfect today, but I will ensure that my kid will have be given some form of dharmic education, a religious education, some form of personal rituals and all. It is very easy. You initiate your kid, you introduce him to, some of the shastras like Bhagavad Gita, or even simple shlokas of our acharyas. There are Vaishnava acharyas, there are Advaita Acharyas, even their Bhakti shlokas. For example, Adi Shankaracharya has written a shloka on a stuti on every deity. You take Kala Bhairava, he has written. You take Devi, he has written here. And Lakshmi, he has written. You introduce these things to kids and introduce them to do some kind of puja at home. You do it and ask them to sit with you just 5 minutes, 10 minutes every day, lighting a aarti, keeping two flowers, chanting one or two mantras, very simple mantras. For proper mantras, diksha is needed, but for nama japa, diksha is not needed. Nama japa of any deity, these are the things which our recent ancestors used to do it 2 or 3 generations back, but we have left it. We can restart it. That is very simple way of reviving our Hindu consciousness, so to speak. I remember that Swami Chinmayananda at one place says that his life mission is to convert Hindus into Hinduism, because Hindus have not have left Hinduism. So, and the second point is, I think you mentioned about how the ISKCON, especially the Vaishnavas indulge in this carry out the Sankirtans in a public place and all. I think we can see that even from the Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's time happening, and how that is missing in Shaiva and Ganapatya and other traditions. I think apart from of course, what you said is correct, that we somehow lack the missionary zeal today. There is another aspect. Shaiva path is basically a path of meditation and self-introspection. There is a saying in one of the Shastras that Shiva is Abhisheka Priya, Krishna is Alankara Priya, and Devi is Archana Priya. So this basically, it's a very basic way of stating that the three forms of worship, they are fundamentally distinct. The Shakti worship is especially associated with mantra sadhana, mantra japa, tantra, and all those things. Whereas Krishna worship is more public in nature. The Vishnu forms are more public in nature, and it has all this Nama Sankirtana, Japa, Parayana, so many things which are even happening today. And Shiva worship is more of self introspective meditation, tapasya. That is there. However, despite this being true, we have evidences from the past that, for example, in Tamil Nadu, they worship this Vaishnava saints, 64 of them. Similarly, I think forgive me, I don't remember the exact number. They worship also 64 or 70 Shaiva saints, And all these saints basically, they were not only acharyas in the conventional sense that they taught shastras, they were also those bhaktas who took the bhakti of Shiva and Vishnu to the masses. So despite these differences in the path of Shaiva and Shakti and etc., even then, these there have been movements to take this worship to the masses. In the case of Ganesha, it is an interesting historical development, I would say. See, the the sampradaya of Ganapatya, it is almost non-existing today. But Ganapati as a deity is worshipped across all the sampradayas. He has become a pan-Indian deity today. Even the Vaishnavas worship Ganapati. The Shaivas worship Ganapati. Every community worships Ganapati. Perhaps he is worshipped first, and then worship all other worships are carried out. That is, he is worshipped as Vigyaharta, and all. But a specific sampradaya worship, the Ganapatya sampradaya, which was there for the last many centuries, especially in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and all those areas, which and even in Nepal, even today you will see many murtis, tantric murtis of Ganapati. See, this Ganapatya sect had two aspects. One is the tantric, more secret form of worship, which were carried out by very few upasakas, which were always secretive. So that is why it was not widespread. That is why it has more or less disappeared. But the popular aspect with Ganesh Purana and those bhakti, it has spread. It has spread, and it has made Ganapati is a pan-Indian deity. So that is a interesting historical piece. But coming to the basic question, I completely agree. We need to take up this missionary zeal, lack of better word. I don't like the term missionary at all. But we need to own up to our civilization, own up to our own identity, and be proud of our identity. And let us not be dhimmi about it. Let us not be feel inferior about it. So once we become proud of our identity, then we do not have an excuse to hide the identity, right? See, this psych is again a product of secular education. Go to school, you cannot put tilak, you cannot put vibhuti when you go to school. And that psych becomes so ingrained that even when we go out of school, we do not put any namam. See, nama, tilak, these are all very basic markers of Hindu identity, markers of our sampradayas, our kulas, our devatas. We have all abandoned because of this secular education, and this applies to everyone, including me. So these needs to be taken up, and these need to be revived.
I think we need to do another show on this. That what needs to be done here. But you brought out very important points, and one of the things which we have to educate people, that there is no contradiction. So you cannot pick a page on Rig Veda and compare with entire Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is summary. It's not a is 700 shloka only. Rig Veda has many thousands. So cannot compare that. Cannot compare pick a line of Brahma, like if somebody writes in Mahabharata that Krishna called for Durga, so Durga is superior to. That is not the way it goes. Nobody is superior. Ultimately, source is only one, Parabrahma. And it's nothing the Vaishnavite view, Shivite view. At the end of the day, common sense has to prevail. Shiva is also a deity, and Ganesh. So there is no contradiction. There is no competition of popularity contest. There is no popularity contest. Before you worship Krishna, you have to worship Ganesh. Very simple, because you take permission to remove a vigna. So everything is related, everything is harmonious, there is no contradiction. This contradiction is itself the secularism which has been taught. And so we'll end the show today. It's a lot to talk, we can go on for days. But for viewers, thank you so much for watching. Do watch it on YouTube and see the second part of the series. We'll come up with the third part very shortly. Namaskar and thank you.
Thank you.